Imagine walking down a street in Havana today.
Right.
You're just walking, and the tension, I mean, it is palpable. You can actually feel it in your chest.
Yeah, it's heavy.
It's so heavy, but it's not chaotic. That's the weird part. It's incredibly, unsettlingly quiet.
Just silent.
Exactly. You pass store after store, and the shelves are they're bare. There's this heavy silence hanging in the air.
Yeah.
But, if you look closer at the faces of the everyday people walking past you, beneath that quiet, exhausting fear of just trying to get through the day, there's a simmering, undeniable anger.
It's a really profound structural kind of exhaustion. Because you aren't just looking at like a bad economic quarter or a temporary recession.
Right. It's not just a dip.
No, not at all. You're looking at a society stretched so incredibly thin that you can practically hear the fabric starting to tear.
Wow. Yeah, and that's exactly what we're looking at today. Welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We are pulling back the curtain on a really fascinating stack of research to map out this slow-burning fuse.
Yeah, it really is a fuse.
It is. Our mission today is to look at how a highly coordinated web of U.S. economic sanctions is just squeezing the island of Cuba. And more importantly, we want to figure out what actually happens when an entire system is pushed to its absolute breaking point.
Right. And the overarching theme that emerges from the data here is one of, tightening pressure.
Yeah.
You have this massive U.S. pressure from the outside, compounding every single day.
Which we'll get into.
Exactly. And then you have these cracks spreading rapidly beneath the surface on the inside.
Yeah, you can't ignore the inside.
Right. It leaves you with a very distinct sense that an entire country's future is it's hanging in the balance, waiting for a catalyst.
So from that visceral reality on those quiet streets, we need to zoom out, right, to the geopolitical level.
Yeah, look at the big picture.
Exactly. To understand why the streets look like this, we have to look at the timeline from 2017 to 2026.
A critical window.
Really critical. The explicit goal driving U.S. foreign policy toward Cuba during this window it's not subtle at all.
No, they spell it out.
They really do. The stated objective is applying maximum pressure.
Maximum pressure.
Right. And the mechanism for this isn't just a broad embargo anymore. It's a web of highly targeted, individual and corporate sanctions.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. How does maximum pressure actually function mechanically?
Well, the shift to maximum pressure it's the crucial mechanism here.
Okay.
For decades, the embargo was, a blunt instrument.
Yeah.
Just a general trade restriction.
Right, like a big blanket.
Exactly. But in this 2017 to 2026 window, the strategy becomes incredibly surgical.
Surgical how?
Well, the U.S. government started identifying specific corporations, holding companies, and military-run conglomerates.
The ones that generate revenue for the state.
You got it. By sanctioning those specific entities, the goal is to cut off the very arteries of the state's revenue. Yeah, it effectively isolates the financial nervous system of the government from the rest of the world.
So it feels a lot like having your credit score secretly ruined.
That's a good way to put it.
Like you could walk into a completely unrelated store, say a supplier in Europe or South America, ready to do business, and your card is inexplicably declined.
Yeah.
Not because that specific store has a problem with you, but because the underlying financial network has just flagged you as radioactive.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. And, the geopolitical strategy extends far beyond just moving money around.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It's a deeply psychological campaign as well.
How so?
Well, the sources detail how the U.S. leverages regional allies and international media to amplify this isolation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. When you have international media constantly narrating your economic decline and neighboring countries pulling back their trade engagements.
To avoid U.S. scrutiny, right?
Exactly. To stay out of the crosshairs. It creates a profound sense of claustrophobia for the regime.
But wait, I have to ask. If the U.S. is squeezing the financial arteries and scaring off Western banks, why can't Havana just, pivot?
Right, the obvious question.
Yeah. Why not bypass the U.S. entirely and trade exclusively with major geopolitical allies like Russia or China? What is physically stopping them from just pointing their ships in a different direction?
What's fascinating here is that the source frames this exact dynamic.
Okay.
That is the multi-billion-dollar question.
Okay.
And the answer lies in something called secondary sanctions.
Secondary sanctions?
Yeah, which the sources highlight as the real teeth of this policy.
How do those work?
Well, the global supply chain relies overwhelmingly on the U.S. dollar.
Right, the reserve currency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if a Chinese bank or a Russian shipping conglomerate does business with a sanctioned Cuban entity, the U.S. can retaliate.
Oh, I see.
They can freeze that Chinese or Russian company out of the American financial system.
Which is huge.
It's massive. Most international corporations simply do not want to risk their access to the U.S. market just to do, like, a fraction of a % of their business in Cuba.
The math just doesn't work for them.
Exactly. The risk-to-reward ratio is entirely broken.
So what does this all mean for the actual regime? Like, is this strategy actually forcing the Cuban government to change its policies, or is it just making the ordinary citizens suffer more?
What's fascinating here is that the source frames this exact question as a major debate.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Does this diplomatic squeezing truly pressure the institution to reform? Or does it merely inflate social tension to a dangerous degree while the regime just digs its heels in?
I mean, human nature says you dig your heels in.
Right. The theory behind maximum pressure assumes that if you make the environment difficult enough, the government will have no choice but to change.
Okay.
But the counterargument is that a state apparatus will always insulate itself first, leaving the civilian population to absorb the actual shockwaves.
And when the state hoards whatever resources it has left to keep the government running, the immediate casualty isn't the politician.
No, it's not.
It's the infrastructure.
Yes.
Which means we have to look at the structural fallout detailed in the research, the systemic paralysis hitting the foundational pillars of the country.
We're talking energy, healthcare, transportation.
All of it.
Yeah.
So to understand why the infrastructure is collapsing, we have to define this concept of hard currency, right?
Yeah, that's central to all of this.
Cuba imports anywhere from, 70 to 80% of its food.
Yeah, around there.
Along with almost all of the oil required to run its power grid.
Right.
But you cannot pay a Brazilian farmer or a global oil supplier in Cuban pesos.
No, absolutely not. That currency has no value on the international market.
Right. You need hard currency like US dollars or euros.
Exactly.
And because the maximum pressure campaign has severed Cuba's access to global banking and basically decimated tourism, the country simply cannot acquire the hard currency it needs to buy the fuel to keep the lights on.
And you can't just print your way out of that problem.
Right.
If you print more pesos to fix the domestic economy, you just cause hyperinflation.
Which doesn't buy you a single drop of foreign oil.
Exactly. The Soviet-era thermoelectric power plants that power the island, they're breaking down.
And in parts.
Highly specific replacement parts from abroad, which require hard currency to purchase and specialized shipping companies to deliver.
And both of those avenues are blocked.
Completely blocked since the grid fails.
Wow. So when you look at Havana's playbook right now, they are essentially doing three things in response to this vice. They are drastically cutting imports to hoard whatever hard currency they have left.
Right.
They are prioritizing internal security to maintain public order.
Yeah.
And they are leaning incredibly heavily on anti-U.S. propaganda to unify the public around a common enemy.
There is a dark, kind of wry irony to the propaganda strategy there. Well, the state television broadcast might be playing incredibly optimistic, highly produced messages about the resilience of the revolution and the defeat of the imperialist blockade.
Okay.
But they are broadcasting those messages to televisions that have been completely powered down for 12 hours due to rolling blackouts.
Oh, man. It feels like watching a crew try to patch a sinking ship from the inside.
That's a great analogy.
Right. Like they're sealing off rooms and using the intercom to tell the passengers everything is fine, but the water is still rising.
It's exactly like that. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises an important question highlighted in the source.
Which is?
Are these government countermeasures actually strong enough to maintain stability, or are they just kicking the can down the road and delaying an inevitable crisis?
They're putting a Band-Aid on a structural fracture.
They are managing the decline, not reversing it.
Yeah.
Relying on internal control requires the population to ultimately accept those measures. But as the infrastructure decays, as the power grid fails and the buses stop running because there's literally no diesel fuel to put in the tanks, that acceptance begins to evaporate.
Which brings us to the human cost. Because the distance between a geopolitical sanction debated in Washington and a family's dinner table in Havana is shockingly short.
It's immediate.
We have to look at what this abstract policy does when it becomes brutally concrete for the people living it.
Yeah, when a state cannot import basics, mere existence becomes a full-time, exhausting job.
I really want you to imagine navigating this on like a random Tuesday.
Yeah, just an average day.
The sources highlight chronic shortages of basic food staples. Then there is the electricity. These aren't just flickering lights, right?
No, we are talking about rolling blackouts that plunge whole neighborhoods into sweltering darkness for days.
Days. Imagine your refrigerator shutting off in the tropical heat.
Oh, yeah.
And all the food you spent your entire week's salary on, if you could even find it after waiting in line for 6 hours, just spoiling right in front of you.
It creates a massive cognitive and physical drain.
I can't even imagine.
You are constantly calculating, when might the power cut out? Which line should I stand in today? It degrades the quality of life on a scale that is hard to overstate.
And there was one specific story in the research that completely floored me.
Which one?
It highlighted a private Cuban business just trying to survive this embargo.
Yeah.
It wasn't some massive corporation. It was just an entrepreneur trying to import basic raw materials to make their product. Not luxury goods, not military-grade technology, just fundamental ingredients. And they had the money.
That's the crazy part.
But the logistical nightmare of getting anything onto the island completely paralyzed them.
Let's look at the mechanics of why that happens. Because it's not just that U.S. companies won't sell to them.
Right.
It's the shipping laws. There is a rule that if a foreign vessel docks in a Cuban port, it is banned from loading or unloading freight in any U.S. port for 180 days.
Wait, 6 months?
6 months.
Wow. So if a European cargo ship drops off supplies for this small Cuban business, they are blacklisted from the entire American market for half a year.
Exactly. What massive global shipping conglomerate is going to sacrifice 6 months of lucrative American trade to drop off a few pallets of raw materials in Havana?
None of them.
None of them. So the supply chain doesn't just bend, it completely breaks.
That is wild.
This anecdote is vital because it represents something much larger. It's the broader paralysis of the Cuban entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah.
We often talk about sanctions denying people goods, but this shows how it actively denies them agency.
The entrepreneur is trying to build something, to employ people in their community, to provide a service, and essentially pull themselves up. But the systemic barriers imposed from the outside are so incredibly high that their ambition is crushed under the weight of geopolitics.
Absolutely.
They are trapped in a holding pattern they have absolutely no power to break.
And when you have a population that is exhausted, hungry, sitting in the dark, and entirely stripped of their agency. Yeah.
That pressure seeks a release valve. Always. The silent fears eventually turn into very loud questions.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because the source document doesn't shy away from the inevitable fallout of all this tension.
No, it hits it head on.
It brings us to a sharp, unfiltered debate that is tearing through Cuban society right now. And, we need to lay this out clearly and impartially.
Definitely.
Because it is the defining argument of the crisis.
Yeah.
Who is ultimately responsible for this immense suffering?
There are two very distinct, passionately held narratives competing for the truth here.
Right.
The battle is over who owns the blame for the empty shelves.
Let's look at the first argument presented in the text. The external blame narrative.
Okay.
This side argues that the Cuban people are paying the ultimate price for the aggressive foreign policy of the United States. They view the maximum pressure campaign as a deliberate, calculated strangulation designed to create exactly the kind of misery we've just described.
Yeah, that's their view. The argument is that no government, no matter how efficient, could possibly thrive or provide for its people under a multi-decade, continuously tightening economic siege orchestrated by the world's largest financial superpower.
Under that view, the fundamental architecture of the crisis is entirely imposed from the outside in.
Right.
The U.S. controls the global financial system,
Right.
weaponizes it against a small island, and therefore owns the resulting humanitarian fallout.
But then on the exact opposite side, you have the internal blame narrative.
Yes, the counterargument.
This side vehemently argues that the Cuban people are suffering primarily due to the gross mismanagement, inefficiency, and incompetence of their own government. They point out that while the U.S. embargo is undeniably real, it is the centrally planned economy, the rigid price controls, and the failure to genuinely reform that actually hollowed out the country from the inside.
Right, and this view highlights how centrally planned economies historically struggle with innovation and resource allocation.
Yeah, that's a pattern.
When the state dictates prices, and controls all major industries. It creates massive black markets and systemic inefficiencies.
Makes sense.
From this perspective, the Cuban state uses the U.S. sanctions as a highly convenient scapegoat to mask its own profound failures in governance.
And it is crucial to understand that we are not here to endorse either side of that incredibly charged debate.
Absolutely not.
Our role is to analyze what the source material is telling us about the situation on the ground. We are looking at the anatomy of the argument itself.
Because what is deeply concerning about these competing narratives is the synthesis of the two.
What do you mean?
Regardless of which side someone vehemently believes, regardless of whether they direct their anger at Washington or at Havana,
Yeah.
the physical result on the street is identical.
Oh.
The shelves are still empty. The power grid is still failing. The desperation is still rising.
The reality on the ground does not care about the political rhetoric.
Exactly. And the compounding economic fractures aren't just academic talking points.
Yeah, they're not.
The research explicitly points out that these pressures are leading directly toward a massive social rupture.
A breaking point.
Yes. The cracks in the social foundation are spreading rapidly, and the voices demanding basic relief are growing louder, leading to inevitable protests as the system simply runs out of ways to absorb the shock.
We've really traced a cinematic arc today.
We really have.
We started by unpacking the tightening grip of U.S. sanctions from 2017 to 2026, looking at the exact financial mechanics of maximum pressure and secondary sanctions. We saw how that international pressure translates into failing macro infrastructure, watching a government try to patch a crumbling energy grid with import cuts while broadcasting propaganda to televisions with no power.
Just a surreal image.
It is. We felt the desperate, exhausting struggles of daily life and private entrepreneurs who are systematically stripped of their agency by global shipping laws.
Yeah.
And finally, we arrived at this fierce, boiling point debate over who is truly to blame for pushing an entire nation to the edge.
It is a slow-burning fuse that has finally reached the powder keg.
Yeah.
And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, building on everything we've explored today.
Late us.
While the Cuban state and the U.S. government play this high-stakes geopolitical chess game, ordinary citizens are finding highly unorthodox ways to survive.
Like what?
We are seeing early signs in the research of an underground digital economy forming.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Cubans are increasingly turning to decentralized cryptocurrencies to bypass both the U.S. financial blockade and their own government's failing banking system.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It's a desperate, quiet rebellion of code and digital wallets. But, while digital currency might help a family buy groceries on the black market,
Right.
it cannot power a national energy grid or import a cargo ship of medicine.
Man, the pressure is at its absolute maximum.
It really is.
The store shelves are still empty, and those quiet streets we walked down at the beginning are now crowded with attention that cannot be contained much longer. We have to ask ourselves, what happens next if everything finally gives way?